10th and final session of Rav Aharon, and I know I've enjoyed so much to look deeper into his life and to give over some of his godless. It's just a tipa min hayam, a drop in the sea of the greatness that was Rav Aharon. But I think we did get a sense of his shleimus, his absolute completion in Torah and in avoda, taking care of people, taking care of institutions, his total achrayus, his fundraising efforts. The reign of Inkala, the fact that he brought a pure corner to Klal Yisrael and to American Jewry, but yet he was also worried about Eretz Yisrael Jewry and Chinuch Atzmai and elections and everything like that. So I'd like to end with really an extremely stirring story, a sad story, but one that in itself stands in its own godless and also shows Rav Aharon's amazing leadership abilities and his obvious Yisrael and his love and his care and his dedication, etc. So we're in the 1940s. It's towards the end of the Holocaust. Unfortunately, as is well known, the Hungarian Jewry thought it could be saved, but was captured by the Nazis at the end of the war when everybody really knew that the Nazis were losing the war. In the terrible months of July and August 1944, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of eventually Hungarian Jewry was wiped out, Hashem Yirachem. But there were negotiations, as well known, called the Musi negotiations. Musi was a former Swiss president who, in fact, was a fascist originally and had published an anti-Semitic newspaper. But somehow the Sternbuchs, I think Rina Sternbuch, her name was an amazing figure, and I believe she swung him over to the side, and he actually went into negotiations with Himmler, who was second in the Reich. They called him Reichsführer, Hashem should blot out his unholy name. And while Hitler was still trying to win the war and etc., so Himmler was already more realistic and was entered into negotiations. And there was negotiations which were in fact up to save all the Jews of Hungary, no less than that. And they're called the Musi negotiations. Obviously, there's a lot of details to it, something that's worth reading about and knowing about and seeing how the failure of the regular Jewish organizations, the secular Jewish organizations, only would work within a regular law system as opposed to the Orthodox Vad, which Rav Aharon was heading to, together with people like Irving Bunim and Rav Kalmanovich were ready to do anything. But anyway, in the middle of these negotiations, obviously it took a lot of money, and Musi was speaking to Himmler and telling him that he was going to publish positive reports about the Nazis. They were all worried about the Yom Acharei, day after. And there was a lot of money needed, and the Vad couldn't get enough money on its own. It had to go to the more secular-oriented joint. And the joint was very against giving money. It was ransoming. We're dealing with the enemy. We're going to give money, and our money is going to go to German guns, etc., like that. Of course, our approach was that, we do anything to save Jewish life. But eventually, through the efforts of Irving Bunim and Rav Aharon, the joint had agreed that they would give money, but they needed a assurance and an issur from Washington, from official Washington circles. By the way, I wanted to mention this, just to know how people were. There was a Vada activist named Herman Hollander. He said, and they needed money. This is Friday afternoon. I proposed to my wife that we sell our very comfortable 3-story home and get the difference between the mortgage and the selling price to the Vad Hatzalah for the release of the ransomed Jews. My suggestion meant that we would have to move into my in-laws' house until we found other accommodations. My wife readily agreed. So at Tzaddikim there were, after my in-laws also consented, we sold our house and gave the money to the Vad. Incredible. So anyway, so we're in Washington now, and Rav Aharon, a small group, Rav Aharon and Irving Bunim, wanted to speak to Roosevelt himself, and they weren't successful getting into Roosevelt, but they got into his old friend and Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, who was in fact Jewish and was FDR's friend already from the New York days when Roosevelt was the governor of New York. And so they needed to prove a transfer of $937,000, and Morgenthau was the last chance. Okay, so Bunim started to, by the way, Rav Aharon only spoke Yiddish, not English. Bunim, of course, spoke both languages, and Morgenthau only spoke English. Morgenthau said, "What? Ransom? Surely you know that the motto of the United States is millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. We can't do it." So Rav Aharon heard this, and Rav Kalmanovich was there also. But Rav Aharon could not hold back his emotions. He stood shaking, his blue eyes blazed. Those blue eyes that we spoke about in our first session together. He pointed a finger at Morgenthau. Bunim, you tell him that if he cannot help to rescue his fellow Jews at this time, then he is worth nothing, and his position is worth nothing, because one Jewish life is worth more than all the positions in Washington. So Morgenthau didn't understand the words, but he sensed Rav Aharon's fury, and Bunim started to translate, but of course in a more diplomatic way. Perhaps because of your high office in government, you cannot force the issue. But please understand that in this case, there are mitigating circumstances. Perhaps something might be worked out. So Rav Aharon understood that Bunim wasn't really translating. He said, Nein, Bunim. Zog dem was gesagt. Tell him what I said. Tell him exactly what I said. So Morgenthau looked back and forth, and then under Rav Aharon's pressure, he said, Rabbi Kuller thinks that position, you may be unwilling to help us because you're afraid of losing your position in the government. He wants you to know that one Jewish life is worth more than any office. Morgenthau looked at Rabbi Kuller's fiery stare, Rav Kalmanovich's anguish, and Bunim's quiet determination. He put his head down on the desk. Minute after minute went by, and people were worried about his health. He had his head down. Finally turned to Bunim, he says, tell the rabbi that I am a Jew. Tell him that I'm willing to give up my life, not just my position, for my people. So Rav Aharon's leadership, his leadership is not even the word, his determination, his love, his anguish, the fire in his soul, the ritcha that existed in him, and his Avos Hashem and Avos Yisrael was so great that it even turned a secular Jew who was a longtime friend of Roosevelt to risk everything to try to save Yidden. This is just a small true anecdote, which again shows us who the Rosh Yeshiva was, and the whole Jewish people. I hope we've all gained some appreciation over these 10 sessions, that each and every day that we wake up to the Judaism that we feel in America, and that's so mushba in Eretz Yisrael also, was from this great efforts of this extraordinary Torah leader. Yehi Zichro Baruch.